So, Ms. Songi, thank you very much for giving us a short presentation on primary EU law, especially concerning the question of EU regulation and EU directives. And thanks again for your help. The floor is up to you.
Thank you very much. So my name is Sabrina Zorgi. Today, I would like to talk about the legislative process of the European Union and also on the types of the legal acts that can be adopted through the legislative process and also other legal acts. So I will just for a moment, I have a presentation. Yeah. I hope that it is visible. Moment.
So it looks great.
So, okay, perfect. So as I just mentioned, I'm here to talk today about the legislative process of the European Union. And I will dive into the agenda. I'm sorry. So the legislative process or the European Union in itself can be very complicated and sometimes overwhelming with regards to its inner workings. And today I would like to shine a light a little bit on the process, on the legislative process and the legal acts. We are going to start today with the foundations of the European Union. I will talk a little bit about the treaties and which make a legal basis for the organs and the process. Then we will talk about the legislative organs, which are taxed with have certain duties within the legislative process. And then after that, we will talk about the legislative process. And in the end, a little bit about the types of legal acts. So the foundation of the EU. There are a lot of treaties, but the primary treaties are, for one, the Treaty on the European Union. This makes the legal framework and the objectives for the EU. And then there's also the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which outlines the authorities, procedures, and policies of the institutions. The Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union also form a legal basis for the operations, for certain operations, including the legislative process. So the legislative organs within the legislative process, we have three that are that play main roles within this process. There's, for one, the European Commission, which represents the general interest of the EU. It is composed of 27 members, all chosen by the member states. The European Commission is the executive branch, and it ensures the implementation and policies set out in the treaties or by the EU Council. I'm sorry, the European Council, I meant. And within the legislative process, it has the exclusive right to initiate, to propose for the adoption of legislation. And then we have the European Parliament, which represents the EU citizens and which is also directly elected by the EU citizens. Within the legislative process, it shares the power with the legislative power with the Council. That's why it's also called the co-legislator. And within the procedures, it adopts, amends, or rejects the proposals of the Commission. The Council of the European Union, which represents the governments of the member states and is composed of the ministers of the member states. It, as I mentioned, it shares the legislative power with the European Parliament, and it's also tasked with negotiation and adopting the EU laws, which are proposed by the Commission. Okay. So on the next slide, we can see an image on the legislative procedure, but I have to mention first that there are two kinds. There are primarily two kinds of legislative procedures. The one is the ordinary legislative procedure, which is the default method. Most laws, most legislations are adopted through this procedure, but there are also special legislative procedures, which in certain areas, in certain matters, their legislation can be adopted through, for example, the Council alone or with the Parliament's consent. And the choice on which procedure must take place is regulated in the treaty, of course. Okay, so on top, you can see an institution I haven't mentioned. It's the European Council. It is composed of the heads of states, for example, the prime ministers of the member states of the EU. And it's mainly their duty is mainly to set out the policy agendas of the EU, which are to be met by the other EU institutions or the EU in itself. So it starts with the legislative process, the ordinary legislative process, which you can see on this image, starts with a proposal, which is submitted by the European Commission. Here in the image, it says 28, but for now, that's not really right, as the Great Britain is not a member of the EU anymore, so it must have. But this is not an image I created, so it has to say normally that it's 27 commissioners, but going back, so the European Commission submits the proposal, and the proposal has to be submitted simultaneously to the European Parliament and the EU Council. But I have to mention that the European Commission has an exclusive right to submit proposal to adopt legislation. But there are also ways in which to trigger there are also other ways to trigger the legislative procedures. For example, the European Parliament, or in some cases also EU citizens, could submit requests for adoption, for submitting a proposal, which the European Commission has to take into account. They don't have to submit a proposal, but they have to take into account and explain on why, for example, it doesn't agree with the request, or if it does, it can submit the proposal. So as I mentioned, this proposal is submitted simultaneously to the European Parliament and the EU Council, and then the first reading start in the European Parliament. There, the European Parliament has the right to adopt, reject, or amend the draft. And if usually it amends the draft, and then it goes back, then the amended draft goes back to the European Commission, which can adopt or accept the amendments of the European Parliament. And then based on the amendments of the European Parliament, the EU Council reviews the draft. Usually it takes 2 readings, going back and forth between the Parliament and the Council, until they can reach a consensus. But there's also room for a third reading. But if a consensus cannot be reached within the second in the second reading, a special committee will be formed, which is tasked to help reach a consensus between those 2 institutions. But if a consensus is reached, then they jointly decide a legislation or a law, and then we have a new law in the European Union. Yeah, but which kind of law can be passed in the EU? So the treaty differentiate between binding legal acts and non-binding legal acts. The binding legal acts which can be adopted through the legislative process I just described are regulations and directives. Regulations are directly applicable. They don't need any national implementation. If they're adopted, they're binding in its entirety. And I wrote on this slide that it doesn't need. There's no national implementation needed. But it also goes so far as in it's not allowed to, for example, pass a national law, even if it repeats the contents of the regulations. So that's because it shouldn't, according to the Court of Justice of the EU, regulations shouldn't be the origins of the regulations or the matter which is regulated by an EU regulation shouldn't be diffused by national legislation. Then we have, and the regulations are considered as the most intrusive type of legal act within the EU. Then we have the directive, which is also binding, but it's not as intrusive as the regulation, as it mostly sets out objectives which allow the member states to devise their own laws on how to achieve those set objectives. And then we have the treaties also mention decisions which are not adopted in the legislative procedures. These are court decisions, for example, from the Court of Justice of the EU, and are primarily binding on those to whom they are addressed and directly applicable, of course. And then we have the non-binding legal acts, which have nothing, but they're not adopted through the legislative process. But I also wanted to mention them as they are also legal acts. These are recommendations and opinions, and as you can hear in the name, recommendations and opinions, they're non-binding and can be submitted by various agencies, institutions of the European Union. So now the question arises: how do we choose on, for example, if we have met environmental issues or, let's say, consumer rights issues, do we choose when do we choose a regulation? When do we choose a directive to regulate this a certain matter? And there's a principle the institutions have to adhere to, and it's called the principle of proportionality. And the principle of proportionality says that the least restrictive measure needs to be chosen for it to achieve the purpose. So it means that if an objective or a purpose can be easily reached through a directive must be chosen instead of the regulation. But if a regulation is necessary to, let's say, to regulate a certain matter, then the regulations can be chosen. Yeah. So this is my short presentation. I hope I could shine a light on the legislative procedures of the European Union. And yeah, thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much. It is very helpful for our students to understand more about European legislation. So if you have questions, you can ask Ms. Zorgi or myself. Thank you, Ms. Zorgi.